I'll turn this over to Mairi for your 5-minute flash talk.
Okay, so I'm going to look at the capacity of offshore wind developments to ecologically enhance adjacent marine habitats. Offshore wind turbines are primarily deployed in the marine environment to create a more sustainable source of electricity and move us away from fossil fuel usage. But as with a lot of structures that are deployed in the marine environment, they've gained a secondary function as artificial reefs. And though the construction phase of these developments is largely noted to have negative effects on the adjacent environment, there's a potential for positive effects to arise during the operational stages. And the idea of this project was to increase the understanding of these impacts by looking at both the available literature and the current project EIAs to try and increase the synergy between these two approaches. So my research design focused on the question, can offshore wind developments ecologically enhance adjacent marine habitats? And looked at two hypotheses. One being that the structures would ecologically enhance their adjacent habitats through the creation of an artificial reef effect. And the second being that the EIAs conducted for these developments would focus on the creation of habitat being ecologically positive, with a sub-question in this, how much literature is actually incorporated into the EIAs. So from a methodology, I did a meta-analysis of relevant scientific literature and a content analysis of 5 EIAs for Scottish offshore wind farms. In looking at the results from the meta-analysis, there was an agreed consensus in scientific literature that there would be an increase in benthic and fish abundance and associated biomass increases, but there was more debate as to whether these turbines would actually increase species diversity and richness. I did a scoping analysis of all the EIAs that were proposed for projects in Scotland, and this is the results of the baseline information. So I looked at whether they'd incorporated this understanding of associated ecologically positive characteristics, looking at whether they'd acknowledged nursery and spawning ground, diversity, richness, and whether they'd acknowledged commercially sensitive species. And then there's a consensus through all of them that they'd looked at this, the economically valuable species, but the scope and depth of the baseline surveys varied significantly throughout each of the EIAs that I looked at. Looking at the literature that was included in the EIAs, this understanding of the operational impacts, so electromagnetic fields and noise, they were substantially included. They had up-to-date information and a lot of surveys that were post-2000, so that would count as state-of-the-art understanding. The understanding of the artificial reef effect and the potential for positive effects to arise from these developments is only beginning to creep into the EIAs, and a lot of the sources were outdated, with some of the sources from 1970s, 1980s as just a basic concept. The understanding of increasing the positive through habitat complexity and heterogeneity was briefly touched upon in a few of the EIAs that I focused on, but it's largely new territory, and though it's acknowledged, there's nothing to go alongside it in the actual changes to the development. So in looking at my discussion, the initial hypothesis, there was some uncertainty surrounding whether these turbines actually could increase local diversity and richness, but that doesn't necessarily mean that ecological enhancement doesn't occur. And there was a noted increased species abundance and biomass for benthic species, which would enhance the feeding grounds for fish and also provide additional shelter. But with this, there's also the aggregation and production debate that's predominant throughout academic literature. There is an acknowledged aggregation of the fish to the turbines due to this enhanced feeding ground, but whether this is actually coupled with an increase in biomass production is debatable, and this could in turn be a negative effect as it could thin out local populations. The EIAs identify that there are potential benefits that may arise with the reef effect, including this increased benthic biomass and potential for enhancing feeding ground, but more firm conclusions would need to be drawn once the EIAs are conducted. And the literature used is up to date for both operational impacts, but less so for the understanding of the reef effect. So, in conclusion, the ecological effects of offshore wind farms are already additions to a highly variable system, and there's going to be a need for long-term monitoring in order to determine whether there's actual population increases of fisheries beyond that of natural variability. And then there's another kind of aspect that comes into it, whether these offshore wind farms should be designed to limit their overall environmental footprint, or should they be promoted to increase as much ecological enhancement as possible. And the worst possible outcome that could arise would be turbines that are designed neither to minimise their footprint or to promote potential ecological enhancement. And yeah.
And that was exactly on time.